This meeting is being recorded.
Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Larry Boris, Executive Director of the National Association of Worksite Health Centers. I'd like to welcome you to our program today, Selecting a Worksite Health Center Partner and Transitioning Clinic Vendors. This is a topic that continues to be of high interest to people as you just get into the benefit of offering a worksite health center, but also the critical part of transitioning to change centers. Typically, these contracts are 3 years or less, and there's not often, but when the time comes where there's a need to start looking for a new vendor, whether it's on your choice or not as an employer sponsor, this is a really critical issue. And so I'm pleased to present the three perspectives for you today. We're going to have the perspective from an attorney, from a service provider, and from an employer, all of whom have been intimately involved in this kind of activity. So with that, I'm going to ask Colleen Dam from Devon Energy, Christine Vargo from Marathon Health, and Stephanie Eckerly from Craig DeVault to introduce themselves once we begin the program. Next slide. So for those of you who are not familiar with our organization, the National Association of Worksite Health Centers, or NAWHC, is the nation's only nonprofit group focusing specifically on the needs of employer and union sponsors of on-site, near-site, mobile, and virtual health centers. We also provide services and have members from the larger marketplace and community. So we support all of those who are involved in this type of benefit and really try to help them and expand and start these service centers, as well as help them understand the marketplace and the benefit itself. We provide a benchmarking and education, networking services, and a variety of resources. We're a clearinghouse of information on the Worksite Health Center area. We have over 100 members and have a website that is a plethora of information for you. As we have our own annual in-person meeting where this is going to be our 10th year. So we'll be celebrating our anniversary and founding September 8th and 9th in Nashville, Tennessee in person. We'll hope you can join us there. Next slide. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Colleen first to introduce herself, and then Christine, and then Stephanie. Ladies.
Hello, my name's Colleen Dame, and I'm the manager of benefits and compensation for Devon Energy. Devon is an oil and gas company. We're in the Fortune 500, and our headquarters is in Oklahoma City. And I'll have the opportunity today to share a little bit about our clinic that's been in place for about 8 years and some recent transition that we went through and some of the lessons that were learned during that time frame. And then I'll turn it over to Kristen.
Hello, my name is Kristen Vargo. I work at Marathon Health. I am the RVP of the Midwest for our organization. Marathon Health is a clinic manager for several employers across the nation. And we have oftentimes been part of processes, including selecting a manager. And then when, as Larry mentioned, there's an opportunity for an employer to want to transition that clinic manager. So from my lens, we'll give the perspective of the management of that transition. Stephanie.
Hi, my name is Stephanie Eckerly. I'm a partner with the law firm of Craig DeVault in Indianapolis, Indiana. And I'm also on the board of the National Association of Worksite Health Centers. And I work with both clinic managers and employers to assist with legal issues involving on-site clinics, benefit issues, and so have been involved in helping with the contracting process for new clinic managers, as well as many clinic transition and separation issues. So excited today to be here and offer the legal perspective on these issues. So we're going to go ahead and jump in today and first talk about just selecting the clinic manager, which of course can have applicability both when you are first starting out on this journey and when you are transitioning. So one of the first things you're going to want to do is make sure you understand what has worked and what has not worked for you. So if you are transitioning, I really would encourage you, and I think this is something Colleen will talk about in more detail later, to think about what works for your company, what's been the good things, but what's been the pain points too. As part of this, you're going to want to understand your employees, and if you have a way of getting baseline metrics, you're going to want to understand those. So for example, what has been your spend on healthcare? Where have you been able to save money? Where have you been spending more? What have pharmaceuticals been costing for your employee population? Are they using the ER and urgent care more than getting annual wellness visits? So those type of things would be really helpful. As part of that, you're going to want to understand the investment in costs, the options and types of vendors, and the array of services. And from the legal perspective, it's really helpful when this has been thought out through a lot of diligence before we even begin selecting a clinic manager. So for example, with options, have you enjoyed working with a local health system? Have you enjoyed working with an independent provider group or a larger clinic manager? And what are your services? Will it be primary care, workers' compensation? Do you want a national telehealth offering? So really understanding these issues first before you even go down the road. And Colleen and Kristen, I don't know if you want to talk at all about that, just really getting prepared to select the clinic manager.
Yeah, I would say from our perspective, thinking ahead as well is very important. Building out the facility based on the investment and cost metric, building 2 exam rooms, yet if you've got a growth trajectory in your organization, maybe you should build for that future growth perspective. And also thinking to the future of maybe, you want to start in primary care, but morph into occupational health and behavioral health and wellness, into the future. So thinking ahead, while you're already doing the investment upfront would be really important to really consider a future strategy.
I can give an example of that from our perspective as well. When we first started implementing the clinic, we really thought about whether or not we wanted to have it be an on-site clinic that was behind secured doors versus a near-site clinic. And so one of our kind of future focuses was that we wanted the clinic to be more available, readily available, perhaps not immediately when we were more focused on employees, but eventually open it up to dependents, retirees, and others that we wanted to have access to it. And if needed, to be able to open it up to other employer groups. And so we made a decision to make a near site clinic that is down a kind of a covered hallway, but not behind secured doors. And I think that's a good example of really thinking about what your future might entail in a clinic so it can remain viable when things change.
Thanks, Colleen and Kristen. Moving on here. So still on the selecting the clinic manager, one of the most important things is putting together your team. So of course, as an attorney, I'm going to tell you, you always need legal counsel involved, but I will tell you, legal counsel cannot do it all. You have to have HR involved. You need to have benefits involved. You might need a facilities person involved, right? You might have someone from the executive team involved. I've worked with marketing before. And so really, and that's more on the employer side, yet alone on the clinic manager too. Once you make your selection, making sure those two teams work cohesively together. The next thing is vendor vetting. So this is really, really critical. And I'm actually going to add this and request for proposals. So these really go hand in hand. Understanding the RFP process is really, really critical, and the vendor vetting process. And so what I mean by vendor vetting, it can take a lot of different forms. One thing from the legal perspective that I always worry about is data security, right? And so I have a form that I encourage all employers to use, and I share with clinic managers too, to make sure they understand what I think they should be filling out, that talks about how do they keep their data? What's their cybersecurity insurance like? Do they have SOC 2 certification? How many years of experience have they had? So all of that can really go hand in hand with both the RFP and the vendor vetting. I find sometimes on the vendor vetting side that some clinic managers don't want to share kind of all the details that you normally would during vetting until that decision has been made. So it's a balance of, making sure you're getting what you need from the RFP, but then once you get through the RFP, making sure you understand any risk so you can really contract around those and understand them. And then the two other really important things when you're selecting the clinic manager, once you've made that decision, is negotiating the master services agreement and the statement of work if there is one. And I think Colleen is going to talk about this later, but when you negotiate that master services agreement, you're really planning, just like they both said, for what's going to happen immediately, pre-launch and once your clinic launches, but also what if you want to add services? What if you want to add or change provider types? What if you want to switch clinic managers, or your clinic manager decides they want to terminate the contract? So really thinking about best and worst case scenario when you go through that master services agreement is going to be critical.
And I would just add here.
Yep, Kristen and Colleen, love your input on this.
Yeah, kind of back to putting your team together, like Stephanie mentioned, having an array of voices of the customer represented in the room when then going through the vendor vetting process and request for proposal. While a greater team might mean, a longer process and or, multiple votes for then selecting that manager. But it's really important that, by having a different aspects of your team involved really makes, a financial decision important, yet, HR involved in what's really going to be the voice of our customer, which is the employee base, and really thinking through, kind of your entire corporate structure, all the different, stakeholders that would be involved in that sort of a decision. So I think that's really important. And then obviously putting in a quick plug, because a lot of times we do have to work through consultant partners and brokers, some of whom are participating in today's meeting. So, a lot of times they can kind of help narrow that scope of the vendor vetting process, because they have to know all the Marathon Healths of the world that are out there. And so they can kind of narrow that scope and then really give you a good list for who maybe should be receiving the RFP. And back to Stephanie's point on, exchanging of data, having NDAs in place and things that might make the process more formal. However, we'll keep your data secure, and then anything we want to provide back to you that might be proprietary to us, making the exchange of data just that more secure. Colleen?
Yeah, I think from our point, our perspective, the team that we put together initially when we started the clinic was a broad team, and Stephanie, you included marketing. I think that's crucial, because communication around the clinic is what's going to get people to come to your clinic. So I point that one out in particular. There are some other vendor relationships that I don't know if you mentioned an architect or someone that's actually putting the physical space together for you. That was incredibly crucial for us in making sure that the clinic looked and felt the way that we wanted it to. And then, as you mentioned, I'll be talking a little bit further about what we put into our contract that made a difference a few years later. And I'll reference that a bit later in the presentation.
Thank you. Yeah, and I would also say one other thing is, from the legal perspective, what's really helpful is have that team put together the deal list, right? And the deal breakers, because there's nothing worse than negotiating a contract on the legal side, 6 months later, having the client call and say, well, I wanted these 3 things included too that were business terms. And I'm thinking, I didn't know that, right? I never was able to find that out from you. And so really putting together that list of things that are an absolute must, and clearly legal counsel should handle indemnification and insurance and liability issues, but the business points really need to be in the MSA and the statement of work too, to make sure there's a meeting of the minds at the beginning when you guys are first starting off. So Colleen, I'm going to turn it over to you to talk about the story with Devin and when you built your new clinic.
Okay, great. So Stephanie mentioned the word story, and that's really what it is. I'll be telling you a little bit of a story about what Devin went through initially to set up our clinic, and then the transition that I mentioned, we just recently went through. That should be helpful to some of you to hear. So when Devin was looking at building a clinic, we didn't know for certain if the need existed. So it was important that we look out into our population and decide if it was really valuable for us to add this benefit. And at the time, Devin was in a situation where we had employees that were spread throughout Oklahoma City. And fortunately, we were able to build a building that could house all of our employees in one place. So we had the opportunity to really leverage a clinic that would be viable and could be easily and conveniently accessed by all of our employee population. In addition to that, we were in the throes of looking at our health risks in our population. This was back in 2012. And we really saw that there was a need for us to put together a comprehensive wellness program. And what we saw as an opportunity with the clinic coming in was to have a partner that could really help us move our health risks in the right direction. And that was very important to us. So once we decided we wanted to have a clinic, we knew that we needed to look at a number of different things. One of the most important things was to decide on the right operating model for us. And keep in mind, this is 2012, so it's been a little while. But at the time, we looked at 3 different models. The first was to have someone that would come on staff as our physician. The second was to have a third party that would provide our management for us. And second, I think I said, and third was to have a local hospital with a community provider group, a physician group that could facilitate the clinic for us. And we ultimately, at that time, decided on the local physician group with the hospital association. And there were a couple of reasons for that. We had a decision to make about needing what we thought was an important community connection there. We also felt at that time that we needed to have a recognized group that was providing that medical care. We wanted it to be very high caliber care, and that physician group really represented that to us, and we believe to our employees. Of course, we had a concern that if we built it, would people actually show up? And so I think an important thing to share there is that there is a trajectory that the clinic starts with. Obviously, it doesn't start at 100% utilization. But one thing that Devin did was, as I said, built that wellness component into our clinic from the very beginning. So it was important that our clinic offer things like annual physical exams and preventive screenings and things that would allow our employees to complete portions of the wellness program that we had in place and earn incentives. And so from the very beginning, that helped our utilization at the clinic. And then from the very beginning, 2013 was when the clinic opened. We offered acute care and episodic care. That was an important day-to-day component of the clinic. Again, the wellness piece really integrated in and took a big piece of the pie as far as utilization goes. And then as we continued on with the clinic, we would add additional services. So that included things like allergy injections and dermatology clinics a couple of days a month, and being able to offer things like sports physicals to the kids and the families. And we developed our own physician-led weight loss program, and that was built from the ground up. So those types of things, we brought a nutritionist in to be in clinic a couple of days a week. These were things that evolved over time as we saw the needs of the population and the needs of the wellness program and where the clinic could fit into that. Stephanie?
Yeah, thanks, Colleen. So when you're thinking about building the new clinic, one of the things we talked about was plan for the worst, right? And I tell people plan for the divorce. So it's like you're dating, then you're engaged, you get married, you pick your clinic vendor, and then you end up divorcing. And it doesn't always happen, but plan for when it does. And so your entire team, including your legal counsel, again, when they're looking at that master services agreement, they should be planning for the breakup and really thinking about the operational implications. For example, how much notice do you have to give to your clinic manager, or do they have to give to you on things like that? So we're going to jump into contract termination. So some of the major legal points we need to think about is, can you terminate for cause or without cause? In a lot of contracts, we will see that during the initial term, whether it be 2 or 3 years, you cannot terminate the contract without cause, and neither can the clinic manager. I frankly think this protects both parties, because you're putting a huge investment into this clinic, and you don't want your clinic manager terminating 6 months in for no reason, just like your clinic manager is also putting an investment into it and probably will make up some of the fees in that recurring revenue. So they don't want to see it terminated 6 months in. But you also need to have a way to get out of it if there is a breach of the contract. Typically, we see that with a cure period. So 30, 60-day cure period, sometimes much shorter if there's, let's say, a big data breach issue where you find out, that there's really egregious behavior. So just thinking about that. Another thing is, does the contract automatically renew? I personally like automatic renewals, because what I've seen when you don't have an automatic renewal is that sometimes people forget to send the renewal notice and we're out of contract then, 3 months into the new year. So watch for that. I've also seen a lot of times where you can only terminate without cause, let's say 90, 120, or 180 days prior to that renewal. So just knowing those dates, if you do want to end up terminating without cause after the initial term, is really important too. How much notice must be provided? Colleen's going to talk about real life issues with that later. But I typically see a very minimum of 90 days. I see upwards of 180 days in a lot of contracts when it's a without cause termination, which I really think, going through some of these with my clients on both the manager and employer side, you need a lot of times a full 6 months, because you have to think, not only are you separating from your current clinic manager, but you're going to bring someone else new in. So you have to have time to get them ramped up. And then you have a lot of patient transition issues and continuity of care that we need to be thinking about. Who will coordinate other vendors during the transition? This was on here. We've had situations before where your on-site clinic manager may be the one that's handling the EHR, the pharmaceutical vendor, the weight loss or smoking cessation vendors, if they're not doing that in-house, the telehealth. And if your clinic manager is coordinating all those, which is often a service that clinic managers do and do very well, what happens during that transition though? Do you on the employer side even know who those other vendors are? And do you have the ability to continue working with them during the transition and post-termination, or do they go with that clinic manager?
And who holds the contract?
And then, yeah, who holds the contract with them too, right? And then is there a termination fee? I've seen that come up. So these are some of the legal issues that we think about, but I'd love to hear kind of the real life perspective of Kristen and then Colleen on these too.
Yeah, and I think it's a fair point to make, Stephanie, that it's truly is a partnership. Nobody marries expecting to get divorced. And yet again, here you are sometimes having to have those difficult conversations, but what's the reality behind the vendor having investments, either whether it be in, the initial setup, the equipment, building out the facility, was that on the employer or the vendor? And so who owns what once it's all said and done, up to termination? Colleen, I know you have some real life examples there as well. In addition to that, the contracts with the employment agreements of the physicians themselves. And so, what happens in the transition of a vendor and the physicians that are, working for technically on-site that employer, but is employed by the vendor. So just really, what does that look like? And then again, coordinating during the transitional period. Are there abilities to have the new manager talk to the transitioning vendor to really work through those details and keep the employer out of it? And so, I think it's best when you're going for divorce to just have those open conversations with the new manager being selected, so that it can be easier on the employer. But that's sometimes easier said than done. So. And then the termination fees are huge and should be outlined in your contract, so that there's no aha moments in the back end once a vendor is selected, that there's going to be a big batch fee for transitioning eligibility files or EHR records or anything of the like. Colleen?
I think just to kind of echo what's being said here, many of the things that are referenced on the slide, we worked with when we went through the transition that we recently did. And it was imperative to have a lot of these things spelled out to the degree possible and understand what the contract reads, so that you have some protections. I'll speak to the details on that a bit later.
Perfect. Yeah, so when we're thinking about transitioning the clinic, I'm going to throw all these up here. We talked a little bit about de-implementation and implementation planning, but I really want to focus here on the communication strategies and rebranding. And actually, I'd really like Kristen, I'm going to put the spotlight on you and Colleen to take the lead on this one, because this is so much more on the business and ops side as far as the communication and rebranding. Other than I will say on the rebranding from the legal perspective, you need to think about who owns the intellectual property. And so if you're going to name your clinic something, so it's not the Marathon Health Clinic, it's the, Devin Dot Clinic or Colleen the Dot Clinic, like you said, right? Who owns that name? does Devon Energy own that, or would the clinic vendor own that, and can you continue using it post-transition? So really think about that intellectual property, even the logos, right? Things like that, and the brochures that go out. So the ownership should be spelled out in that master services agreement. But Kristen and Colleen, if you want to talk about communication and rebranding, I think those are critical.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll just highlight very quickly, because Colleen, I know you've got a great case study around this, but really in the de-implementation planning process, you should be talking about who's going to notify who when. The worst thing that can happen is, an employee finds out in a clinical setting that physician is going to be leaving because, Marathon Health is no longer going to be the vendor of choice. So just really making sure through that de-implementation process, the targeted timelines of when the terminating vendor is going to be communicating, and then when the new vendor of choice is starting their communication strategy. So there's no water cooler talk or aha moments that lead to, a ill-timed communication piece going out. And then back to the rebranding issue. And again, Colleen, I know you'll talk a lot about this. Is there an opportunity if it wasn't a great experience for the patients themselves, really doing a full refresh? Hey, we heard you loud and clear through surveys that you're not happy with who we had selected. So, even refreshing everything from an aesthetic perspective might make people feel like, okay, I've been heard, and now we're going to have a new way of doing things in the employer-based clinic model. So really thinking through the why you're changing that vendor. And if it's all back-end business problems, maybe you don't need to refresh anything in the aesthetics of the clinic itself, but maybe it needs a whole rebranding refresh based on patient satisfaction or dissatisfaction of why you're transitioning vendors. Colleen?
Yeah, I would say our experience, a couple of things that that were important that showed up during our transition. The communication strategy, it's imperative that everyone be on the same page with that communication. So if the provider is being asked by a patient what's occurring, there should be the same message as what's been given out on a kind of public basis to the employees. It's so for us, we try to be as transparent as possible about what was happening in different stages. That was important, not to remain silent, but to give as much information and provide as much continuity as possible while everyone was going through this transition. And I mean everyone, because the patients were, were wondering what was happening. The providers were wondering what was happening. This was a time that was difficult for everyone. So communication was really important. And the rebranding, that's an interesting thought, and I'll talk a little bit more about it, but I think that's something to think about in the very beginning when you are considering what you're going to call that clinic or who's going to name that clinic, and then what that could mean later on in the future. Do you want to rebrand it, or have you gained enough leverage with the name that was established from the very beginning that you don't want to lose that? And that's an important component to think about.
Thank you, Colleen and Kristen. So moving on here, we're going to talk about kind of some more of the, I would say, nuts and bolts and mechanics of things that I get involved with on the legal side too. So one is medical records. Medical records are a critical thing to think about. So providers, whether it's a physician or nurse practitioner, all have an obligation to maintain medical records under state law for so many years, right? But of course, if you're transitioning clinic vendors, you want those new medical records to go to the new clinic vendor so you can ensure continuity of care. And so from a legal perspective, we always need to think about, one, can we transfer those records legally? And can we do that without getting patient authorization under, for example, a treatment exception under HIPAA? Or are you going to take the approach that patient authorization is needed? I have seen that done both ways. I've also seen when the clinic is shut down completely and we're not transitioning, thinking about those records. Another big issue is, how are those records being transferred? So literally the security of that transfer. I'm assuming they're not just being sent to an email address of the new provider. I have seen that happen though. If both of your providers use 2 different electronic health record systems, they should be able to export those records from one system to another, especially if they're using certified EHRs under the new Cures Act. So really thinking about the nitty-gritty medical records, that seems to be a big issue and a really critical one. Another one that we see is prescription drugs and supplies. So this one can be challenging and can depend a lot on state law. So in some states, you cannot have one clinic manager A, transfer drugs to clinic manager B because there's a prohibition on the wholesale distribution of drugs. So because those are not being prescribed to the patient, you can't do that company transfer since they're unrelated entities. And so if you are in a state where you cannot do that, how is that going to be handled? Is the clinic manager that is terminating going to just kind of wind down that supply? And if you already paid for those, but yet they can't be transferred to the new clinic manager, will you be reimbursed for those? So just a lot of really business decisions to make there. I don't work with many clients that keep controlled substances on site, but that's a whole other issue to think about if there's a transfer of clinic managers. Supplies are a little easier. I see those transferred often, but I've also seen new clinic managers come in and say, hey, we want a clean slate. We don't want to use anyone else's supplies. We know what we have. We have, chain of custody. We're going to start fresh. And that should also really be spelled out in the master services agreement. Facility management. So again, who's managing that facility? Is it an on-site facility that the employer manages, or is it the clinic? We've had issues before where the employer doesn't even have keys to the facility, right? They don't know who's paying the utility bill at the facility. Phone number, who gets the phone number? So thinking about the facility management aspect. And then the last two here, more on the business and ops side, which we've talked a lot about, clinic aesthetics, but also additional investment. Are you going to be changing the clinic when you bring in that new vendor? And who's paying the upfront cost of that? Is your vendor or is the employer? And how is that being spread out if it is over the term of the contract? Kristen and Colleen, any thoughts on these?
I think you did a great job from a legal perspective and just the state by state regs that require some, limitations to the ability to transition. But, back to Colleen's point, communicate. The more you can tell the patients what you know at the time, the better. Go to the clinic and ask for your medical records in case there can't be a batch transfer for some reason or something, gets lost in the shuffle. Communicate the timeline that you'll be able to go get your last fill of prescriptions and, see the physician or on-site provider one more time. And then again, back to kind of facility management and aesthetics and investment. Is this a time that you want to make some changes to the services provided at the clinic? And therefore, that's another time to communicate with your patients. Hey, we're getting rid of this, but we're adding this. And so could it be seen as a positive? But the more you communicate with your people and the more they feel like they're part of the process as it's transpiring and then being added back in, the more they feel like they have an opportunity to kind of get some of these things done one more time.
I'll add that our experience was as soon as information was out that there was going to be a change in the clinic, the very first question we had was about a transfer of medical records. That became a big part of the conversation for our employees. It was a source of anxiety for some, and so it was important that we have that lined up pretty quickly and that our employees understood that we understood the concern that they had and that there was a way for medical records to be transitioned as quickly as possible. And also just the facility management piece, that's something that I'll speak to a little bit later, but that is important when you have especially a truncated timeline, not to have to worry about your provider having the responsibility of the facility and maybe the contract with the facility. I'll speak to that a little bit later in my presentation, but that's an important piece as well and can make things smoother in a transition if the company itself has the sublease or has the lease on the facility.
Last slide on kind of the nuts and bolts here before we turn it over to Colleen. So patient notification. This has been a really big issue in some of the clinic transitions I've been involved in. So under most state laws, if the physician is ending their relationship with a patient, they are obligated under their medical board licensing rules or nursing board, if you're using an NP, to send notification to the patient. And so if you're in a situation where the physician is not going to the new clinic manager, which we'll talk about in a second, a lot of times you will have to give notification to those patients, or the physician will need to. So that's something we always talk about up front. And the way I've seen those worded is, that this physician will only be available until, August 1st. After that, we will be able to provide continuity of care because we have a new provider coming in, and here's where you can reach them. Whether the physician's contact information post-termination is provided is a big issue. In Indiana, there's a new state law that if a patient requests that physician's information, let's say, that they went back to community practice, you have to provide that. And so really understanding what the laws are around patient notification and how that's going to be handled, and making sure that the employer, new and old clinic manager are all on the same page about that is critical. And in that master services agreement, it's really important to think about who controls that notification and who gets to review that notification, if anyone. The continuity of care. So we talked about that, both with patient notification and just ensuring that, especially if there is a shutdown period with the clinic, so they're not starting, one closes one day and then 2 days later the new vendor is coming in, making sure that your patients know where to get care in the interim, and especially what about, prescription refills and things like that. So that's something that I've seen in contracts. The clinic manager have to ensure for a post-termination period of like 30 or 60 days that there is continuity of care. I've also seen employers not want that at all, though, because once that is done, they want to move on with their new clinic manager. So I think it really depends on what that discussion is between your clinic manager and employer. The last two are provider issues and restrictive covenants. So this is a really, really important one for both the clinic manager and the employer, and it's going to impact your patients. And so can that provider move to the new on-site clinic manager? Maybe they can, but they might be prohibited to do that through a restrictive covenant. And I think there needs to be really clear communication between the employer and the clinic manager at the beginning, if that's going to be the case, so that expectations are set about whether that provider is going to stay or not. And I think too, whether you're on the clinic, especially on the clinic manager, you need to understand what are your legal obligations from a non-compete perspective. So again, in Indiana, we have to now provide providers a buyout in their non-compete for at least new employment agreements. And so understanding those things are going to be really critical. Along with the non-compete, which is a type of restrictive covenant, a non-solicitation is critical. So, can that provider leave, open up a community practice, and then start calling the former patients and texting them and everything to not go to the on-site clinic? I've seen that happen before. A confidentiality clause with your providers is really critical, and your clinic managers, and then in employers too, if the clinic manager is giving over proprietary information. And then the last type of kind of restrictive covenant, I don't know if you can call it that, I've seen as a non-disparagement clause, which can actually come in very handy, and something that protects everyone too. And again, planning for that divorce. So Kristen, I don't know if you have anything on those issues, and then after this, we'll turn it over to Colleen to spend about 10 minutes really giving the more detailed story about Devin.
No, I think you really walked through that very well. But again, just the provider issues with no aha moments in the investment of transitioning clinic vendors, meaning, if you want to buy out that provider contract, what that really looks like financially for the organization.
Perfect. Okay. Colleen, I'm going to hand it over to you, and just let me know when you want to flip slides here, and we'll give you the last 10 minutes.
Okay, that sounds great. So back to the Devin Clinic story. When we left the story, the last slide that I was on with this, we were talking about how the clinic had been built up. It was 8 years running, and it was very successful. It had really become an employee benefit that was valued. It was a recruiting and retention tool, and it was something that our employees would point to in surveys and indicate how important it was to them to have the clinic and to have it available to them. So it was, as I said, successful. Utilization was very good. We had gone through a transitionary time frame with the employee population. Oil and gas, as you know, has gone up and down in the last 8 years. And so our employee population has gone up and down as well. But we had made transitions, and we had made decisions that helped the clinic continue. And we all felt that there was a strong commitment to the clinic. So it was a surprise to us in March of 2021 when I received a phone call from our current local provider, and they advised us that they would no longer be able to provide our services at the clinic. And in fact, the contract was terminating at the end of June. And since this was mid-March when I received the call, that meant that we had just a little over 90 days for us to transition out of the current provider and try to determine what we were going to do with the clinic, if we were going to continue on, and if we were going to continue on, who we were going to be able to find to help us with that. I will say here that there is nothing that sends you back to your contract as quickly as an unexpected termination notice. And that's exactly what the news from our provider did for me. I went back to our contract. Keep in mind, it was written 8 years prior. And so I want to share with you today how that contract helped us, some of the things that Stephanie has talked about, and some of the things I wish I would have known that I wish could have been in the contract. So when we received the news, the first thing that we started to do was take an inventory of what our protections really were that were in place. And a couple of things that stand out to me to share with you. First of all, the equipment was completely owned by Devon. And I think that was really important. From the very beginning, we put the money into making the clinic what we wanted it to be, from an aesthetic standpoint, from a caliber of care standpoint. And so we had made those decisions early on what the equipment would look like and what the care suites would look like, and how we wanted to have the clinic outfitted. And we kept and maintained that equipment over that 8-year period. So we knew what our inventory was, and we did not, in a pinch like we were in, have to go out and find new equipment and completely kind of redo the clinic again. So I felt like that was a real benefit to us. The second thing, we talked about facilities management, or who really kind of owns that contract with the facility itself. And in Devon's situation, we actually lease the space that the clinic sits in. And then we ask them to sublease it from us to practice medicine there. And that was very beneficial for us because we did not have to relocate the clinic or consider whether or not our provider would actually leave that space, or if they would try to maybe stay in that space for longer than we expected them to. We were in control of that particular area, and that was extremely helpful for us. The third thing we've talked about a little bit already, and that was owning the name of the clinic. And from the very beginning, Devon established the name of the clinic, The Doc. And then we would have sort of a subtitle under that said, provide services provided by X. And that was an important piece of the pie or the puzzle when we got the news in March, because we didn't have to really think about how we needed to rebrand the clinic. That brand, The Doc, has been established. Our employees recognize it. As I said, they put value in the clinic, and the name The Doc carries that value for them. And we did not want to have to start all over again. So in our situation, in our case, it made perfect sense that we would continue to use the Doc name. And I think it was a significant protection that we had that available to us during the transition period. So another item, and Stephanie touched on this as well, but this is an area I wish we could have changed, but we had we did have an auto renewal for our contract that had been going on, and it was a year-to-year auto renewal. And we, at one point, had a 60-day exit clause for no cause. And at the time, when I saw 60 days, I thought, oh my gosh, that's not nearly enough time. This was a few years back. And so we were able to negotiate a 90-day exit. I wish I would be able to go back and put that in at 120 days minimum. 180 days would have been much more helpful. We had 90 days. And we tried for 120 days when we had the conversation initially. And at that point, the provider just wasn't ready to sign on for anything more than 90 days. And we had to take the 90 days. But I would strongly advise to consider a 120-day or 180-day exit period. And I recognize that puts the employer in a position too, where you may not really love working with this provider anymore and want to be 120 or 180 days continuing with them. But well, it really would have made a difference for us to have had that time to be able to find the new partner and move forward without having a disservice to our patients and not being able to continue care at that site. So that was an important thing that I learned along the way. So some further protections that we had in place, one of them was a non-compete. Some language that was in the contract. Stephanie referenced that previously as well. That was very important. We had the language that indicated that the current provider could not solicit our employees or the current patients at the clinic. We also had language that they could not establish a clinic that was nearby or could be considered in competition with our current clinic. So that took that out of the equation, and we didn't have to be concerned about that. There was some language in the contract as well about transition of the successor vendor, that the previous or prior vendor had to work hand in hand with the successor vendor. There had to be a time for us to work together. And in fact, we did work together. I was very pleased with our prior vendor and the times that they came kind of to the table and gave us information that was needed that would have made it harder for us to have the successor vendor in place in time. So that was important language in the contract, but I think the relationship with the prior vendor was a part of it as well. And when I say relationships outside of the contract are so important. We really have built a strong foundation of relationship with the providers themselves that were at the clinic. And at the time, there was no intent or reason to do that other than to know that we wanted to have strong relationships with them. They were part of our family. But that really made a difference later when we were in a position where they may or may not have been willing to consider continuing as a provider at our clinic when the management changed. And I can talk a little bit more about that on the next slide, but it's important that you put time and energy into developing relationships with the people who are running that clinic for you. And they should be part of the family. They are really contributing strongly to what you are doing as a company. Thanks, Stephanie. So the other thing that I think is important when you're going through a transition like we were going through is taking the opportunity to look at where you're at with the clinic. It's almost like it resets you to way back in the very beginning. Do we need a clinic anymore? Do we want it to look the same? Does it need to have the same hours? Should it be still accessible to all employees, dependents, retirees? Is there another group we need to be considering? Those are things that you have the opportunity to reevaluate when you are changing your provider arrangement. And so that's kind of the silver lining to it. And then also, what changes are needed in the future? Is there anything that needs to be considered for the far future that perhaps you weren't able to do with the current partner? I kept a notebook of things that was kind of a wish list for me of what the clinic could do. And there were times when our local provider could not do those things, but our new provider may be able to facilitate some of those. So that's important to have that wish list available. When we finally said, yes, we were definitely moving forward with a clinic, we were definitely finding the new provider, and there will be a clinic in place, then we turned our attention to things like improvements to the facility so that it would be ready in time for a new provider or a new partner. We wanted to make sure that it looked fresh and clean, and that the equipment and technology was there that was needed and the contracts were in place. And then, of course, you always have to ask yourself when you're looking at the decision on who's going to be your provider, what do we value in a clinic partner? And for us, the word partner really is important. We want someone who's flexible, who'll listen when we say there's a need. Can you find something that can help us with this need? Really think outside the box. And that was the type of clinic partner that we were looking for. Next slide. So we did make a decision. We had in the 90 days that we were working through this, we had a short list of possibilities for a replacement partner, and we did look at a local community hospital and physician group. It would have been easy for us to have said, we'll just replicate this and it'll be easy to do. But we also looked at third-party vendors, and we did decide on a national vendor that would be able to bring a lot of experience to the table and some options for us with our field employees that hadn't been there in the past. So I'm gonna be really quick with this slide because I know we want to leave a couple of minutes for questions. But I just want to say, in our situation, it was important that we provide care while the clinic was closed, because we did have to close for a period of time. And the partner that we had was able to provide us with some near site locations that we could send our employees to, so they still had continuity of care. We facilitated medical records to the utmost degree so that we could reduce the anxiety around that. We sweat the small stuff. We looked at, like I said, what the facility needed to freshen up and what we could change in the rooms, and what equipment wasn't there that perhaps was really needed, what services weren't there that we really thought needed to start being allowed, that type of thing. And then, of course, the most important thing, communicate the change. And we've said that already. At different junctures, you have to communicate continually with the employee. What's happening? What are we expecting? What are your options for care? And then when the clinic finally reopens, a big splash and a lot of excitement about the fact that our provider that we had previously was actually able to return, and at least on a part-time basis. And then we were able to fill the rest of the staff with some stellar staff. And the one thing I do want to mention that I may have missed, or I may have another slide, but I'm not going to get to it, is that we were really, part of the contract protection was that our provider, although we could not directly solicit them, it was possible for them to go out and apply to the postings that our new vendor provided online for open positions. And every one of the staff, we did not approach them, but they approached us and asked us who the replacement vendor was going to be. And then they went out and looked to see if there were open positions they could apply for. And I think that speaks to the relationship I was talking about that you have to build with your staff and their commitment to the clinic itself. So I'm going to end there because I know we want to open up for questions. And
Well,
Larry,
that's great. Thank you, Stephanie and Colleen and Kristen. We'll go a little bit past the hour, so we'll allow people to ask questions, but I'm going to go through the attendee list and encourage you to participate. So let me first start out with Andrea Bilderback. Andrea, if you have any questions or comments you'd like to make. If not, we'll move on. Anne Marie Sharp. Anne Marie, do you have any questions or comments you'd like to make?
No, I don't. Thank you.
Okay. Ashley Pratt. Ashley, any comments or questions you'd like to make?
No questions. It was a great presentation, so thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mara Skokorski, any comments or questions? Okay. Carl Sentz, any comments or questions, Carl?
Nothing, Larry, thanks.
Okay. Dawn Sparks, Dawn, any comments or questions like to make? Okay,
I
John
just saw
Dawes.
that unmute.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No. I just saw the unmute button pop up. I just thank the panelists for their candor. I thought it was very helpful getting everyone's perspective.
Thank you. John Dawson, any comments or questions?
This is a very good presentation. I do have a question for Colleen. You talked about continuity of care while the health center was closed. Can you elaborate on how that was done?
Sure. There were 2 near-site clinics that were part of our new partners arrangements. And one of them was actually downtown Oklahoma City. And so that was the key area that we sent our employees and dependents to for care. And we were able to use the model, the fee model that was being set up for the new clinic arrangement. So it was nice for them to experience that from the very beginning, what the changes would be.
And do your employees still have access to those other health centers, or was that just temporary?
Great question. No, they don't. We made the decision to close that off when the clinic opened. We may reconsider that in the future, especially for dependents, if it makes it more feasible for dependents.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Sarah King, any comments or questions, Sarah?
No, I thought it was terrific. And that last question was particularly helpful as far as how Colleen transitioned. I missed how long that period was from the local physician group being your vendor to the national vendor. What was the downtime that your clinic was closed?
The clinic was closed from July to mid-October.
Oh, wow. Okay. And to clarify, your new national vendor, you went to one of their other sites that was local. Is that what you said?
Yes, they had 2 near-site clinics that were local, and we were able to send our patients there during the closure of the clinic.
Okay. Are you willing to clarify if you were working exclusively with a physician provider, or have you used APPs in the clinic?
It was a physician provider group that was affiliated with the hospital, the local hospital. Does that help?
It does. I was just curious on site, if it was APP on site caring for your employees with physician oversight, or was there a physician on site?
No, I'm sorry. Yeah, it is a physician. An MD is in the clinic.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Lenka Fisher, Lenka, comments or questions?
No comments and no questions. Thank you. It was a very good information.
Thank you. Tracy Waffenberger, Tracy, any comments or questions? Tracy, no? Okay, I just have a couple of other questions that came in. I don't know, Stephanie or Colleen, if you want to talk about how many vendors should someone consider when they're out searching for either an initial clinic partner or a transition to one?
Colleen, I'm going to let you take the lead on. Well, you're probably going to.
I was just going to say, Stephanie, do you have an answer on that?
So I'll tell you, I've worked with on the employer side. Usually we have a consultant or broker in place that really helps narrow it down. And when I get involved as legal, when it's on the RFP or kind of pre-choosing, usually they've narrowed it down to 3 or 4. And a lot of times I'll get involved because we're looking at, okay, here's their EHR, here's their security standards, here's their staffing model is a big one, NPs. They want to do on-site dispensing or have a pharmacy, what's legally allowed. So when I'm pulled in, we're usually down to just a couple. But Colleen, I'll let you talk about how many you know, you guys considered, or Kristen, if you've ever been in a group with like 10 other competitors. I don't know that.
Yeah, I think when we first opened the clinic, we had an RFP, we had that kind of the traditional approach, and we threw the net wide to see what types of management were out there, models were out there. And so we had a much larger group. I think we had maybe 10 on our list that we went out down from. Now in our quick transitionary 90-day period, I really had to narrow it down very quickly. It helped that we only had one provider in the market that was even willing to do a local hospital physician group. So that was one. And then we looked from there to see who else was in the market that could work with us. So we were down to 3 pretty quickly.
Yeah, I would say given your goals, that should kind of frame how many you think you want to go after, given the service model you're thinking of going toward, who's good at what, and your consultant should be able to help you with that.
Yeah, I would just comment that in a lot of cases, I found a broker or consultant may not be that familiar with the market, and they may only suggest 2 or 3 that they know of, or perhaps they have a partnership or a business relationship with. And it's important that the employer does give a chance to look at the providers, both the health providers and third-party vendors, large and small, that serve your kind of center scope that you're looking for. And lastly, let me ask Stephanie and Colleen and Kristen, what's your thoughts, pros and cons of providers, health providers as a clinic vendor versus a third-party vendor itself?
Oh man, this is a whole nother seminar we could do, Larry, on this question alone. I mean, I think there's advantages and pluses to both. I have seen national providers just hit it out of the park and can offer services that other local providers may not be able to. So like Colleen talked about, having kind of the shared clinic model and the network, which I know a lot of them do, having a national telehealth platform, having more access to a lot of different really neat resources for your employers, and just having experience doing this with both big and small. But I've also seen local providers that have, like we have a few regional and county hospitals here in Indiana that do on-site clinics, and they have such a stellar reputation too in that county or with that local group that it, you know, it might be easier to kind of sell that to your employees and increase utilization, at least at first, when they know that it's the trusted name that they also take their kids to when there's, you know, a broken ankle or something. But lots of pros and cons. Colleen and Kristen.
Yeah, I would add, you covered a lot of the great pros and cons, Stephanie. The things I would add is if you work with a local group, you may end up with needing to really monitor the referrals that are going to their local hospital. And we started that from the very beginning, and we didn't have as much concern around it because we worked with the provider, and he understood that we wanted the person to be referred to where they really needed to go and not just be feeding into that network hospital. But that's a key concern. And then also, if you're working with a large hospital, it becomes an institution of sorts, and it can be very hard to move an institution forward. So you may end up being hemmed in by what is just not possible because that institution is large and it's just not going that direction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with all those comments. I would say go back to your original goals, and that should drive your decision of what vendor might be the best for you based on flexibility, need, referral patterns, and reporting. A lot of hospital systems, this is not their core strategy of what they do. So do they know to bump up against reporting packages and how they're buying down claim expenses? And just, so again, what are your goals and what are you looking for?
Great, thank you.
Kristen, real quick, the utilization and reporting is huge, and understanding what analytical tools the providers have. And I agree, I have seen in some cases kind of the more national clinic manager models have much more sophisticated reporting tools.
Could you go to the next slide, Stephanie, please?
Oh.
So we have our upcoming program. Next one, February 8th, is actually planning your first worksite center. And we're also going to talk about the value of accrediting your center and the value of that. February 23rd, we're going to be talking about how hospitals can create their own worksite centers for their own employees as well as others. We then have a program in April on behavioral health services and the kind of innovations that you can be doing and what you need to do. And then please put on your calendar September 8th and 9th in Nashville, Tennessee, in person, the NAWC Annual Forum. With that, I want to thank our speakers, Stephanie Erkely and Colleen Dame and Kristen Vargo, for their involvement and their time to take. And thank you all for participating. Look forward to seeing you at a future program. Everyone, well, we will record this and this will be available at the NAWHC website for our members. Everybody stay safe and have a good week. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.